Hi, my name's Sally, and you might have seen me around before. I've been Tora-Con staff for a few years now, and that includes running some panels, and I've been doing art for Tora-Con for a while. And so I wanted to do a panel with you guys to talk about anatomy. And that doesn't just have to be about realism. Knowing a little bit about anatomy can help you in all sorts of art styles. Knowing about proportion, knowing about bone structure, it can just make your art look a little bit more believable. Believability has nothing to do with realism. It's just knowing, oh yeah, a human body can move like that, or oh, where did her rib cage go? All right. So speaking of skeletons, I'm going to start by talking about human skeletons. So obviously most anime characters don't look like actual human proportions unless it's a very special case. But knowing how all these bones look can inform you of how to start with your character. I tend to start an illustration by using basic skeletal shapes, and that doesn't mean I'm drawing a realistic skeleton at all, but if I start up here with the head, then I can use that structure to build out where I want the shoulders, where the rib cage is going to go. I just like to use an oval shape here, so it kind of informs me of how far in I can put the skin and the clothing and whatnot. And then I block out the hips like so. The hips usually connect very far to the sides for women and a little bit further in for men. But in general, you're going to want to actually have the hip joints off to the side of the hips. Legs are just straight lines, and the thighs are pretty much the same length as the shins, so that one's easy to get down. Same goes for the arms. Something that I use for reference a lot is that your elbows are approximately at the same height as your belly button, and so that helps inform me of how long the upper arm is, and then I just copy that length for the lower arm. Hands, on the other hand, I just kind of block out at first, like you can see here. You don't need to go into full detail at first. I really just do this to get a pose down. You can see here what I did with the same skeleton shape, but just posed a little bit. And so just getting this shape out really helps me figure out if the leg is long enough, or if the head's at a good angle, or if I'm moving the spine in a way that doesn't quite look right before I go into any detail and have to take a longer time fixing that later. So you can see I did a little sketch over this, and I've worked out the actual legs and things, where the torso is, underneath the clothing, so that I know how it folds and whatnot. But that skeleton shape helped me make this pose almost perfect in terms of proportion in just one go. A little bit more on proportion. You're going to have all sorts of different people in anime. And they can be tall, they can be short. I know myself, I like a lot of shoujos, so you see characters with super long legs. The reason that these characters all look okay, no matter how tall or short they are, is because they follow correct body proportions. All of these figures you see here are cut in half at about the hips. So from the hips up and the hips down, they're the same height. That helps so that a character this short in the middle can be as tall as a character on the right. Proportion is also important when it comes to heads. And this is one that a lot of people tend to struggle with. So what I want to show you here is kind of how I break down a head like I already have. I tend to start with an egg shape for the general shape of the head. And this can be really messy as you start, so don't worry about it looking just super sketchy in the beginning. When it comes to the head, I start by breaking things down into thirds. And then I break down the middle and lower part of that third into another half. This section right here is what I'm going to use as reference for the eyes. So again, this is a really, really sketchy version of this to just show you that if all of these things are in proportion, it still looks pretty okay. This line right here is what I'm going to reference for the tip of the nose. And so the nose does actually come a little bit below that. But in general, that's how far the nose will go down to. And this other line that we put down here is for relatively where the mouth is going to be. Obviously, every person is different, but in general, it's a good guide to start with. You can always look at a lot of real-life people as well as other illustrations that you like to see how they've exaggerated the proportions. I'm also using this upper line to block in where the eyebrows will be. And so I put the inside of the eyebrows right about at that line, go up, and then come back down. And I keep it relatively even on the outside as well, because that's just how a lot of people's eyebrows tend to be. A lot of people like bean eyebrows. And so if you're going to do the little bean eyebrows, it's the same concept as starting right here, except you're just going to cut it off around the middle of the eye. And that's about the width that most people do. If things start to look a little weird here, another thing to look at is where your eyes are placed horizontally, and as well as how wide your mouth is horizontally. Eyeballs are approximately one eyeball apart. See, I've drawn these a little big, but still, if I draw another eyeball to the side and in between, it's pretty close. If you're drawing really big eyes, like you will with most anime styles, you're going to follow the same rules, but you are going to follow the center point of that 5-eye wide rule. So even though I'm making these eyes a bit bigger, their center points are still going to be where they would be if the eyes were a realistic size. And so even though these eyes are large, if I were to break this up into 5s again, you'll see that the center of the eyes is still relatively following that guide. In addition, a lot of anime may move the eyes a little bit lower or higher just for a stylistic preference, but a good place to start is here, and then if you want to shift them around a little bit, it's always a good starting point. Obviously, if you're drawing chibis, your eyes are going to be even bigger, but again, that's just a good place to start from, and if you want to jump off from that, it makes it a lot easier. I have this sketch that I started, that I pre-made for this panel, so that I didn't have to do the entire sketch in front of you guys. But as you can see, it's showcasing the bone rules that I did. You can see the rib cage right over here. And you can see where I blocked out the hips on either side. Since these hips are kind of in a 3/4 view, you can kind of see a rectangular prism shape that I used, with this hip back here being on the back side of that prism. In addition, the posing is a kind of technique that's used in a lot of classical art called contrapposto, and it just means that I've tilted the shoulders in one direction and the hips opposite. It's a nice way to show your character relaxing against a wall or just standing not quite so straight up and down. If you take a look at a lot of classical sculptures and things like that, and even if you look at a lot of promo images for anime, you'll see a lot of characters have that sort of tilt to their shoulders and hips to make them look a little bit more relaxed. In terms of some other proportional tricks that you can see on this skeleton here, the hands are approximately as big as I made the face. There's obviously a lot of stylistic choices in anime, like the really big hands and stuff like that. But if you want it to go a little bit unnoticed, hands and faces are a good match point. And don't be afraid to use yourself as a match point. So if you're wondering, oh, how tall is my palm? You can always put it up to your own face and see, oh, my palm is about from the bottom of my nose to the bottom of my chin, and then use that as a reference on your own drawing. In addition, you can see that trick I mentioned before about the elbow being about belly button height. Even though the torso is a little bit tilted, you can see I use my own body a lot to reference this. And so where the lower elbow is actually kind of where it sits if I do this pose myself, and the other elbow is a little bit higher than that because of the tilt. Another thing that I see a lot of artists struggle with and profess their hatred for is drawing feet. It's another one of those that there's a lot of stylistic choices, especially like Kingdom Hearts or something like that, that they want really big feet, and that's just a perfectly fine stylistic choice that they wanted. If you want the feet you draw to not be attention grabbing, the hands, again, once you take them from the face, are another good indicator of how big the feet should be. Typically a person's hands are just a little bit smaller than their feet, and so I tend to take the hand and match it to this part of the foot. You can see that my drawing is a little bit big, so I should probably make that a little bit smaller, but on this foot, it's a little bit closer. Now that I've talked about proportion, I want to talk a little bit about curves. Even though your bones are stiff, they're not completely straight. You're actually going to see a lot of ways that straight lines and curves interact. And so if your figure looks a little bit stiff, that might be something to look at. Good places to make sure that you have a little bit of a curve are in the spine right here, as I used as an example before, in the calves. And in the arms as well. I and a lot of other artists and a lot of anime artists tend to put the straight lines at the outside of the arms and then keep the curves to the inside. And so that would be one way to make sure that if your figure feels a little bit stiff, it's a good place to add in some curvature. Another struggle point I'm going to talk about is breasts. A lot of people struggle to make them look like they're actually sitting on the rib cage and that they're actually attached to a person. So as a quick guide for drawing from the side and from the front, you're going to want to have the center be about at the center of the rib cage. And so drawing that skeleton at the beginning can really help you in the long run. They also aren't completely perfect spheres. You're going to want to start with a sphere to get the bulk of the shape, but the sphere does not sit completely on top of the rib cage, so you'll see that this one goes a little bit inwards. In addition, there's skin attaching them from the top. You're going to want to start from a little bit below the collarbone, which is also around the armpit. So on this one, you can see here that I started at the armpit and followed around the curve of that sphere that I drew. in order to get the natural shape. And this trick works for any size, so I'm just going to do a quick drawing right here that you can see of a rib cage. This is a bit of a wide rib cage, but that's okay. Everyone's a little bit different. And here's where my shoulders would be. So I'm going to look for that halfway point approximately for the rib cage. Let's go a little bit bigger this time. And so we'll get a little overlap in the center. Let me just make those circles a little bit more circular. And then again, follow that shape from the armpit. Then we can add in some extra lines in the center or whatnot for stylistic purposes. But if I draw a different colored line over that, you can see that that's a more natural shape that feels actually attached to the rib cage. So let's get back to that sketch I was talking about before. I'm going to take this from a skeleton to finish to show you exactly what I'm talking about in terms of how much building from that skeleton up helps, and remembering to utilize curves and proportions. So I'm actually going to make this into a girl. So I can show you the same technique from a 3/4 view. Halfway point from the rib cage. We're going to start with circles. And then take that armpit line. All right. And then I'm going to make that a little bit more transparent. And we're going to clean it up directly on top so I can really show this to you. Here you can see even from a 3/4 view we have that surge trick when it comes to the face. And so I'm just going to make this a little cleaner. So showing you that even that grid-like technique will come out looking pretty natural. Looking at reference is always a useful thing, whether that reference be real-life models. You can find all sort of pose reference if you just Google an image. Go for action pose reference or sitting in a chair reference. Really adding reference to the end of any action will come up with at least a few images that you can use. I also follow a lot of small-time cosplayers, fashion people, on Instagram, and so that gives me a lot of inspiration for posing. Any sort of models or fashion people, or even other artists. Getting inspiration from someone is not copying, just as long as you don't completely copy it verbatim. Don't trace, don't copy it exactly, but look at other people to see what sort of thing you like. Do you like extreme poses like JoJo? Do you like say Sailor Moon sort of poses where it's very energetic and jumpy and bubbly? Do you like really serious action poses, sort of Demon Slayer sort of thing? It can help you find a starting point for what you want to do with your own work. If you happen to be struggling with ears, a good reference point for that is to have this starting point of the ear line up approximately with the eyes, and then have the bottom of the ear line up towards the nose. And remember that this is, if you're drawing a person, people making these expressions. And so if someone's eyebrows get scrunched up or they're really happy or something, there's going to be extra lines in the face. Now, you don't want to go overboard with it or make them too thick, otherwise you'll make them look like wrinkles and you'll start to make the person look older. But see how I have these thin little lines right where the eyebrows crease? And using your own face as reference is, again, always a great way to go. I know you've all seen the jokes about artists making the faces of whatever they're drawing while they're drawing. It actually really does help. As far as hairlines go, they're actually approximately halfway between the top of the eyes and the top of the head. So even when you're drawing a character with long bangs or something, it helps to identify that point for where the bangs will start. So I'll give this character like a really nice center piece of hair, you know. And then draw a couple more strands just to show you that connecting them to that point is just a good place to start. In addition, most people's hair is relatively thick, and especially in anime, they draw really thick hair. So you're going to want to leave some space around the top of the head to show that that hair is not completely slicked down to the skull. If there's any place of anatomy that you're particularly having trouble with or you don't like on your own drawing, honestly just really look up reference for that, or look at your friends, look at yourself. Identify the basic shape of whatever you're looking at. For instance, I used to have trouble with this area at the back of the head of the hairline, and then I just took a good look at the back of someone else's head and realized, oh, the back of the hairline is basically just a triangle. And then so that helped me identify how to draw those. Notice the smile looks a little bit creepy because it's just a little bit too wide. That's a fun thing that a lot of anime does, where it's just a little bit too wide. Normally a person's mouth only goes to approximately the width of their pupils. So extending that like just a little bit like I did here, so that it's almost in line with the side of the eye, just makes it look a little bit creepy, you know, like a vampire that I'm drawing right now. This under part of the neck is something that I see people forget a lot, and it tends to make the head look like it's not actually attached to the neck. So try to just avoid drawing a straight tube for a neck. Even if you're going really stylized and the person has just a little bit of a curve, it does help. And see, now I'm getting down here to the shoulder. You can see that use of straight versus curves that I was talking about. So the back of the neck is a little straight, the front's a little bit curvier. This little connecting piece of the shoulder is going to be kind of straight. And then we have the big roundness of the shoulder. And here's that play of the outside and the inside of the arm. So even if the character's not super muscly, which I do tend to draw, giving it a little slight curve will make it look a little bit more natural. And so here we go with getting back to the chest. The way that I'm going to stylize this is having this outside emphasized because you would be able to see the silhouette, and then just adding little accent lines to imply the other side. Make sure to leave the room for the rib cage, and then the torso can curve here. A common mistake I see, which I'm gonna show you right now, is that people will go straight in and then it'll look like a noodle body. If you're drawing something like Adventure Time or something like that, that works. But if you wanted to go for a more natural style, then make sure to leave room for this rib cage. I'm not going to put in too much detail on here because we're going to be putting clothes on top, but you could see that approximately this is where that belly button would be, and there's where the elbows line up. In addition, if you're having trouble making your characters look particularly feminine or particularly masculine, a very telling part of the style is where the hips are. So you can see that I've drawn the curve of this body so that the hips are almost at the belly button. That's a lot more of a feminine shape than if I were to draw a typically masculine body. I would have put this area approximately down here. Lowering that down just makes it look more like a masculine skeleton. All right, so I'm going to take particular care to show you how I take care of hands at this point and how I take care of feet. It's very structural, but it helps me identify the front, side, every piece of the hand, the fingers, and it really results in a lot better of a hand and foot for me personally. And so I have this sort of trapezoidal shape that I'm using to showcase the palm, and placing the thumb right on that side that I set up there. And so I know that the thumb looks like approximately 2 pieces, and so that's how I'm drawing it. And then each finger is actually 3 pieces, but the end one is a little bit shorter. So I'm going to start with these little sketchy pieces. Here's that little end piece. These are going to be some long fingers. But this goes to show that even if you want to stylistically move away from perfect realism, following some proportional rules will keep it looking like it fits together. Remember to utilize those straight and curved aspects. A lot of complaints I see from people is, oh, my hands look a little too stiff. And so a way to solve that is to make sure to just use those straight lines on the outside of those fingers. And so here's my curves. They're not that extreme, but the fact that it's at least a slight curve makes it look more like a natural pose. And so that's a little bit hard to see, but we're going to show again on the other hand, and I'm going to draw it a lot lighter since you already know what I'm doing. So this hand is holding something, which means I'm drawing at a bit of an angle. But you can see that I'm still paying attention to those straight lines and those curves. And obviously I could clean that up a little bit more later, but that's a good place to start for structure. Use your own hands too to model after for your characters. For instance, if you look at your hands just in a natural pose, it's not completely straight out. So take a look at your own fingers the way they are in a relaxed pose and think, oh, I'm going to draw this knuckle straight and then get it a little bit of an angle, or oh, my pinky is a little bit lower than the rest of my fingers. Just little nuances like that make the pose look very, very natural. If I'm really struggling, I also like to actually take pictures of my hands and put them on the canvas next to what I'm drawing. And so that helps me really pay attention to what that skeleton structure is doing. Now down here for the feet. You can see I've drawn these really big joints for where the heel is supposed to be. There's the bigger part of your foot at the heel and then right before the toes. So you don't want to draw a straight box. Even if you're drawing shoes on your character, it's good to at least get an idea of where the foot inside it is. And so if I were drawing a character with shoes on, I would stop there. You can already see the heel, and you can already see that bigger part of the foot right before the toes. And in your head, you know, oh, this is where the toe part of the shoe is going to be. But if I were to draw a character barefoot, I would really take the time to take that same shape I was just using and draw out the toes there, showing less and less of them as they go back to show perspective. Now see, that's not perfect, but at least it's getting me a little somewhere. So you can see that they're approximately the right size, and I would go in and have to continue cleaning those up, but it's at a point where I can move on and look at my other foot. Remember to make the heel go a little bit further back. Again, even though it's posed like this, it would still have that little bump behind where the shin ends. I said earlier that this one was a little bit long, so I'm actually going to apply that now. And here's that bigger part of the foot near the toes. And then I would do that same thing of following the shape to draw in approximately where the toes would be. And there we go. That's the vague shape. And I could clean those things up a little bit, but that's where we start. And that's where I would typically go and look for better photo reference or something, or take my own photo reference of myself to get a more detailed idea of what that would look like. Now I'm going to sketch clothes over this. So you could take an outfit that you have yourself, or take a look at some outfits in photo reference to get an idea for how these things drape and whatnot. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because this is an anatomy panel and not a clothing drawing panel, but to give you an idea of how anatomy plays into putting clothes on top of that, I want to show you a little bit of that process. So if I were to draw this character with, say, a necklace on, I'm not going to draw a straight line right there. I'm going to follow a bit of the curve of the neck. So it actually looks, at a glance, like a necklace, rather than like a straight line across the neck. If I were to draw something with a bit of a puffy sleeve, I'm going to follow the top of the shoulder because gravity will pull that down on top. But then as the arm itself goes in, I'm just going to continue the puffy sleeve out. And do that same thing with the other side of the arm. And so keep in mind how gravity is affecting the clothing that you draw. And really just hanging that fabric in your brain over the skeleton that you drew. I'm going to do the same thing with the breasts, where I'm going to let this shirt drape over the furthest out point. And I'm going to let it come in a little bit, even if it wouldn't in real life, to follow the figure a bit, but I'm not going to suction cup it to the body. Most clothing, unless it's like really specifically tailored to do so, will not completely hug the body. So you can see that I'm drawing like little indications of where the wrinkles are going to be right over here, and then letting it drape with gravity onto the skeleton. And so again, to emphasize that in a different color, I let this piece drape off of the side. So this is the furthest out point, and I let gravity pull it down. And I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom. So in order to give this the same idea, I'm going to give her a skirt. And so since this leg is up a little bit, it would be holding the skirt over here. And this non-form-fitting skirt on the other side is going to do that same draping of gravity. And so it comes off the furthest point of her hip and goes straight down. And so to connect the sides, I'm just going to follow that leg the way it went and then let it fall this way. And so there we go. That's a basic drapery on top of a skeleton. To show you that this also works on a really stylized character, I'm going to do a quick chibi with you guys and use the exact same techniques that I used on this more realistic character on the chibi to show you how it applies on any style. We're going to start with my head as usual, even though it's going to be bigger this time. And I'm going to try and do the same pose to show you guys. And so I'm going to have this rib cage here. The shoulders going this way. And the hips going that way. One leg out. And the other bent. And see, even though I'm giving this panel on anatomy, I don't always get it right the first try. You're going to erase a lot. You're going to, if you're going digitally like I just did, just change the proportions up by selecting them. And you can see, even though I have this little tiny chibi body, if I were to put a normal size head on top of this, you can still see I'm following that half and half rule as far as proportions go, and just throwing that big stylized head on top. Let's clean that up on top. So you can see, even though this chibi is looking a little bit sketchy stylistically, I followed the same proportion rules that I did for the more realistically shaped head. These eyes are following that rule of thirds, so is the point of this nose, and this mouth is about halfway between that chin and nose. Same thing with the hairline, where it's about halfway between the top of the head and the top of the eyes. Here we go with giving those little curves to the neck, even though it's going to be a pretty straight up and down neck for this chibi. And as I go, I decide, I don't like how wide these shoulders are. So even though I'm still bringing it in a little bit, I'm following that bone structure that I laid out. No matter what you're doing, you can always decide that you don't like it halfway. You don't have to follow these things exactly. You're not drawing it to look like a photo. You're drawing it to draw it. And so there we go. Even though it's still got some problems because this was a really quick sketch, you can see that the same bone structure and the same proportional value was given to both of these. And you can tell. You can tell how their weight is sitting on their bones. You can tell that they have a rib cage. You can, their face is very not distracting. And knowing these sort of guidelines for bones, proportions, and all that, you can go further and look at muscle diagrams or something if you're going to be going off and drawing JoJo characters. Being able to apply that reference to your own work can go for any sort of reference. And now that you know these rules, you can break these rules if it's for stylistic purposes or for comedic purposes. A lot of the funny faces and things that you'll see in anime and other related media is that in order to show something comical, they're just going to go off of the entire proportion rules or something like that. I was talking earlier about making the smile a bit too wide. If I were to just do something real quick, I can just draw a smiley face and put the eyes a little bit too far apart. And look, that's a little bit of a funny face. Or if I were to do this same simple face and draw the mouth a bit too big, again, there's something inherently creepy about that. And so now that you know these rules, you can break them in your own work. And when you do so, it's going to be entirely deliberate. It'll give people more of the feeling that you're going for. It'll help you understand how people see other people in real life, and so it'll influence how those people see what you draw. I hope you guys enjoyed this panel and that it's helpful to you and that you enjoy the rest of your Tora-Con experience.